In this episode, we'll take a look at the Zoom F8n Pro. In this entire episode, you're hearing the Zoom F8n Pro, which is recording the audio from an Earthworks SV33 microphone. That's what you're hearing through the entire thing here. Now, in this episode, I'm going to focus on the features that are new and unique to the Zoom F8n Pro relative to the F8n and its predecessor, the Zoom F8. So let's go ahead and have you go over and look at those other videos. If you want to see all the features, of course, we have the summary up front. And then also, I bought this with my own money. Nobody has paid me to make this review. So you're just getting my impressions. And also, from my perspective, I record dialogue audio 99% of the time and sound effects and Foley the other 1% of the time, just so you understand where I'm coming from. So what's new in the F8n Pro versus the F8n and the F8? First up, 32-bit float wide dynamic range audio recording. We'll talk about what that means in practical terms in just a minute. Secondly, for those that use Android phones and tablets, there is now an Android-based app for remotely controlling the F8n Pro. Previously, it was just an iOS app. Of course, the iOS app is still available. And finally, some people might see this as a con, not really a con from my perspective, but in the F8n and the F8, there was a dual channel safety track recording feature where you could bring a microphone into input number 1 and you could record it on channel 1, but you could also record it on channel 4 at a lower gain level. So if things got too loud and they distorted on the input channel number 1, you always had that backup safety track 4 that was at a lower gain, so it wouldn't clip there, at least presumably. That feature is not included on here because I think the engineering and the product managers were thinking at Zoom that it wasn't really necessary with 32-bit float audio recording. Okay, what is 32-bit float wide dynamic range audio recording? In digital audio, if the audio gets too loud, it will clip, it will distort, and it will sound awful. And we'll demonstrate that in just a minute. But with the F8n Pro in 32-bit float mode, and because there are 2 analog to digital converters for each microphone input, it generally won't clip. And let me explain what that means. So the audio comes in to the F8n Pro, and normally on a traditional mixer or recorder, what would happen first is that the microphone signal, which is a very weak signal, would come in and be amplified. It would be made louder by a preamplifier. Then that analog audio signal would be converted into digital through an analog to digital converter, and then it would be recorded. What's different here is that the audio comes into the F8n Pro, and it doesn't go through a preamplifier, or at least not one that you can set the gain on. It just comes straight in, gets converted by 2 analog to digital converters. One that handles the louder sound or the higher amplitude sound, and another one that captures the lower amplitude or the quieter sounds. And then once it's done those conversions, it brings them back together into a single audio file and records them in a 32-bit float file. So what that means is that normally, if you set the gain too high on a traditional audio recorder, you get this distorted audio. In this case, it can handle a very, very wide range, very, very loud to very, very quiet sounds. And so you won't generally run into those issues as often. Now, there's some important things to keep in mind here. This is not a complete get out of jail free card. If you're using a low quality microphone that can't handle the, really loud sounds that you're trying to record, it will still distort. It'll just distort at the microphone instead of in your recorder. So you do have to have a very high quality microphone to be able to handle this massive dynamic range. So that's the main idea. It can be very helpful in a number of circumstances. And for me, I think the number one use case from the perspective of someone that does recording like me, mostly spoken word audio, mostly interviews, podcasts, corporate video, things like that. If you happen to be a solo operator, by that I mean you are the one that sets up all the lights, the camera, you're operating the camera, you are directing, you're recording the sound, you might be interviewing, all of those at the same time. That's a lot going on, and sometimes you might mess up some of the settings. You might not get them exactly right. That's where, from my perspective, 32-bit float can be really helpful. Now, another circumstance where it might be really helpful if you're recording sound effects and you're going to be recording things that get really, really loud, and in that very same recording, things that are relatively soft. That's where 32-bit float can also help you. Not something I do quite as much, but that's another potential use case. Now, I want to be really, really clear here. This is a neat feature. It's a tool. It is something that can be useful in some circumstances, but from my perspective, it's not useful all the time. For example, let me give you an analogy. If you are someone that films with a digital camera that's capable of filming in RAW, if you over time get enough experience with that camera, my question to you is this: how often do you actually film in RAW, or how often do you actually need to film in RAW? And I think that's the analogy to me is, in my experience, is that you don't need to shoot RAW very often. In fact, there are just a very limited number of circumstances where it's really, really critical. And I think the same is true of 32-bit float audio. So I don't want to burst anyone's bubble or rain on anybody's parade, but this is a nice feature. It's a nice tool, but it isn't necessarily something that I think everyone absolutely must have all the time, or else you can't possibly record a good audio track. And that's not true at all. With a little bit of skill, you can. Even with a Zoom F8n that doesn't have 32-bit float audio recording capabilities, you can still make good recordings. However, the 32-bit float, nice tool to have in the toolbox for those rare circumstances where you really need it. Let's get you a sample of what 32-bit float audio can do for you. All right, we have a sample here where I recorded with the Zoom F8n Pro. The first one is where we set the gain at a reasonable level, somewhere around 45 dB of gain with a condenser microphone, the Earthworks SV33. Then we set it to the lowest setting, which is a plus 10 dB, and then we set it to the highest setting, 75 dB. If you've never heard clipped audio, it sounds a little bit something like this.
All right, same sample, still on the Earthworks SV33, still on the Zoom F8n Pro. We are riding very high on gain. This is plus 75 dB. We've got sound blankets on the table, left, right, and center, and we'll see how this sounds.
Okay, now, if I were recording with a traditional 24-bit or 16-bit recorder, this audio would be irreparable, impossible to repair in a quality way. Now, there are declipping plugins that will reconstruct the waveform as best they can. They're resynthesizing the sound is basically what they're doing. When it's clipped this badly, it couldn't make it sound good. But since this is a 32-bit float wide dynamic range recorder that we used, you actually can save this. What I would do is I would highlight it here, and I'm in Isotope RX, but you could do this in a lot of other apps as well. You can see right now it's going 28.3 dB above 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull out my little gain tool here. We'll drop by 30 dB. Now this is what it sounds like.
All right, same sample, still on the Earthworks SV33, still on the Zoom F8n Pro. We are riding very high on gain. This is plus 75 dB. We've got sound blankets on the table, left, right, and center, and we'll see how this sounds.
Okay, here is at the kind of a traditional gain level. So here I set the trim on the Zoom F8n Pro to 45 dB.
All right, this is a test recording with the Zoom F8n Pro. I am talking into an Earthworks SV33. We've got sound blankets on the table to my left, right, and forward. We are at 45 dB of gain, and we're going to change that throughout this recording so you can hear how this sounds at different settings. There's no post-processing on this channel.
Okay. I would say that the one that was recorded here at 45 dB sounded ever so slightly more natural to me. Nevertheless, this would be a serious lifesaver if you set the gain inappropriately. So that is a definite advantage here. Here, we recorded at a much lower level. So right now, if we pull up our loudness control, we see we have, we're sitting at our peaks are at minus 35 dB essentially. So if I add, let's say 32 dB, or somewhere right around there, That puts it right here. Let's listen to this now.
All right, we are now at the lowest gain setting possible, which is 10 dB. We've got a sound blanket on the table to my left, right, and front and center. I'm talking still into the Earthworks Audio SV33, and we still have no post-processing on this channel.
Okay. Now, normally what would happen is the noise floor would get really, really loud if you pulled something up by 32 dB. Here, if we look at our stats here, we're still doing pretty well. Our max RMS level is now at about minus 60, which is actually quite good. So that is the benefit of 32-bit float recording with a sample of spoken word dialogue. Now, one of the other features on the Zoom F8n Pro is an Automix feature. This is especially helpful in things like podcast recording or perhaps panel discussions, if it's a video recording. The challenge in those circumstances, if you have multiple microphones, each person has their own microphone and they're seated relatively close to each other. What can often happen in those circumstances is that when I talk, my audio goes into my microphone, but my voice also carries, might bounce off the walls. It'll also go into the other microphones that we're recording to at the same time. So what will happen then is that will sound kind of phasey. It'll have this kind of weird comb filtering sound to it. It's not the best sound in the world. And so what Automix does is that when I'm talking, it will keep my mic active, but it will pull the fader back. It will reduce the level on the microphones for the other people that aren't currently talking. So what that results in is that you end up with a mix that sounds much cleaner. It sounds much better. And here's an example. Okay, in this sample, we have the Automix turned on. I am on the Earthworks SV33, and Danny is on the Neumann U87 AI.
Ooh, sparkles.
Yeah. That's right. Sparklies.
Ding!
Okay, so you went on a walk this morning and you said that you saw quite a few birds. Tell us about that.
It was a lovely walk this morning. It was before the wind picked up. So first I saw an oriole, a male. It was bright yellow and black. Yellowish orange and black.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, I saw a bald eagle flying around.
Now, as we talked about before, the Zoom F8n Pro is unique from the standpoint that the audio comes in from the microphone. The very weak microphone signal comes in to the F8n Pro, and normally on a traditional recorder or mixer, it would go through a preamplifier. Now, I don't know exactly what it's doing here. What I do know is you can't set the analog amplification level or gain level on the F8n Pro. When you adjust what is called trim, which is typically a synonym for gain, you're actually doing that after the audio has come in and been converted to digital, and then you're adjusting the level on the F8n Pro. Very different approach. Some people might be concerned and think, well, is that a problem? Does that create a very noisy noise floor, a very prominent noise floor that you can hear because you're lifting up the overall amplification level post-conversion, and it brings up the noise floor with it? Let's actually take a look at some tests I did here to evaluate that. And another question we're going to address right here as well is that how does the Zoom F8n Pro compare to the SoundDevices MixPre series of recorders, which also have this 32-bit float wide dynamic range audio recording capability? Well, I did some tests. What we did is that my friend Julian Krause made this little XLR adapter for me. It is an XLR connector without a microphone cable connected to it. So we can plug that directly into the input on the Zoom F8n Pro and also on the MixPre. And in addition to that, it has a resistor soldered across pins 2 and 3. Why? The reason we do that is that it actually emulates the load that a microphone would place on that microphone input without actually feeding the audio from a microphone into the recorder. So what that means is that we can set the gain or the trim level and do a recording, and what we're measuring there, what we're actually capturing in that recording, is nothing but the noise floor of the preamplifiers. And this is what we found. Here are the exact numbers. These are not A-weighted or anything like that, which is typically done for equivalent input noise specifications, but what we're measuring here is that self-noise of the preamplifier at various gain levels and with or without the limiters turned on or not on the Zoom F8n Pro. And what we found overall is that both the Zoom F8n Pro and the SoundDevices MixPre II in this case have extraordinarily clean preamplifiers. These are great results across the board. Now, there was one little oddity that I noticed, and that was with the MixPre III, when we recorded in 32-bit float mode, the noise floor was a little bit louder, interestingly. But in 24-bit mode on the MixPre, it got the very best and the lowest noise floor measurement of all of the recorders. So something interesting going on there. In short, if you were to apply a high-pass filter to all of these, or weight them like they typically do for equivalent input noise specifications, these would all be pretty much in the same category, and they would all be incredibly impressive results. Now, keep in mind, 75 dB of gain, which is one of those columns you see there, that's an extraordinarily high amount of gain or amplification, and very few microphones require that much gain. In fact, in this case here, for example, we have the trim set to 45 dB of gain. So we still have a lot of headroom here. We could add another 30 dB. But as I said, most microphones, even things like a Shure SM7B, generally require somewhere between 60 and 65 dB of gain. So there are very few circumstances where you would need to push the preamplifiers all the way up to 75 dB. And so what I'm saying in a lot of words, which could be condensed down to a very few words, is the Zoom F8n Pro and the MixPre III, for that matter, have extraordinarily clean preamplifiers with very little self-noise. So if you're getting self-noise, you really need to be concerned that it's probably your microphone and it's probably not the preamplifier on the recorder. I think a lot of times, too, people confuse self-noise, which is generated in the electronics by either the microphone, perhaps in your cable, or your audio recorder. In most cases, it's probably going to be the microphone is the most likely candidate if you're using a condenser microphone of any sort. One last thing I noticed as well, while we're on the topic, is that when I turned the limiter on the Zoom F8n, that actually bumped the noise floor up a little bit, just the way it works. It's a hybrid limiter. It's not technically an analog limiter. So it bumped the noise floor up by about 3 dB. On the Zoom F8n Pro, it didn't. So they've done something different about the implementation there somehow. So that's actually really good news. I would have fewer qualms about using the limiter on the Zoom F8n Pro. And in fact, in 32-bit float mode, you probably don't need it anyway. Just do all of the compression if you need any in post, and you're good to go. But if you do want that limiter on there going into your recording, or you're doing a live stream, then you also have that option as well without adding additional noise to your recording. So let me kind of sum things up and also talk about comparisons to other recorders here very quickly. First of all, the Zoom F8n Pro is probably the most capable field recorder at a price of $1,100 USD that I have ever used. Really impressive recorder, and I think Zoom has done an amazing job here. For comparison, the SoundDevices MixPre II, probably the nearest competitor in terms of features, comes in at $1,775 US. So if budget is really important to you, you have a really great option in the Zoom F8n Pro. I would also say that the Zoom F8n Pro is the most impressive recorder I have seen from Zoom of any of their recorders to date. Now, how does this compare to the Zoom F6? If you have a Zoom F6 and you're wondering, should I upgrade? Or if you're trying to figure out, well, do I want to get a Zoom F6 or a Zoom F8n Pro? I will say this is purely subjective. I very much prefer a few things on the Zoom F8n Pro. Obviously, it's a more expensive recorder, but I think it's a lot more ergonomic. It's easier to operate because you have more dials, knobs, buttons. I think the menu navigation is a lot easier with its big encoder dial. So for that reason alone, I would choose the Zoom F8n Pro, but there's some other things as well. It does have dual SD card slots, so you can record a backup recording to the second card if you want to do that, or you can record something different to the second card if you wanted to do that. And also the power options, I think, on the Zoom F8n Pro, that just give you more options. You have an AC adapter that comes with the recorder. You can also power it via its Hiroshi input, so you can connect big Cine batteries or other battery distribution systems to it. And of course, you have the internal AA batteries. I will say, however, the AA batteries I really see as sort of a bridge solution. It's not, I will say this, if you're going to get the Zoom F8n Pro, you need to have an external powering solution in mind. The AA batteries are not going to power you for very long. So if you turn on all the inputs, for example, and you're recording with those at a high sample rate, you're going to get about 30 minutes of recording time with 8 AA alkaline batteries, just to put it into context. If you have an F8 or an F8n, should you upgrade to the F8n Pro? Now, this one's an interesting question, and I think it really depends on the circumstances. So if you record dialogue audio solo and you can't be bothered to take the time to set your gain properly, I think you really should take the time to set your gain properly, and you still do need to do that, I think. But this is a potential solution for that. Again, if you're one of those solo operators where you're doing everything, this is sort of a kind of a safety net option for you. I think it's worthwhile in those circumstances. You could also get away with an F6 for that matter. But do keep in mind that if you are going to record in 32-bit float for recording dialogue, what you're doing in essence is you're pushing the process of deciding how to manage your audio, and any cases where the audio goes above 0 dB, which normally would be a clipping point on traditional recorders, you're going to have to take care of that in post. So you're delaying taking care of that into post-production, and you need to use an app that can handle 32-bit float audio files. Now, in 2022, when I'm recording this, the big editors that are available out there, Premiere Pro, Final Cut, both support 32-bit float audio, so it's not a problem there. It's potentially a bit more of a problem if you're using Avid Media Composer. And, of course, most digital audio workstation apps at this point support 32-bit float audio. Now, what about if you record sound effects and nature-type recordings, things like that? Only you can really decide if 32-bit float audio is going to be helpful for you in those circumstances. I really advocate, people can make great recordings without 32-bit float audio. We have millions of hours of content out in the world that prove that. But again, it's a tool, and it's a useful tool. You'll have to make that decision on your own. I just need you to understand that it's not going to be like suddenly as soon as you upgrade to an F8n Pro, all the angels are going to be singing because now there's no such thing as digital clipping anymore. That's not true. You're still going to have to use a high-quality microphone. You're still going to have to use good microphone techniques. The 32-bit float audio doesn't take away the need of having someone with skills to operate all this to get the best quality sound possible. There's still tons of things you have to do and learn to get good quality audio. This is just one tool that makes things a little bit easier. There are a few things that the MixPre does a little bit better, and there are a few things that the Zoom F8n Pro does a little bit better. There's no clear-cut, single, objective answer to which one is better. It just depends on what features are important to what you're doing. Let me give you some examples. The MixPre II series has a 3.5mm input. The Zoom F8n Pro does not. Is that a big deal? Depends on what you're doing. You can always get the 3.5mm to XLR adapters that actually convert phantom power to 3.5mm plug-in power. So there are options there, but if you're going to be using a 3.5mm input a lot, a MixPre might make more sense for you. The Zoom F8n Pro has the proprietary Zoom interface for the Zoom microphone capsules. Now, for some people, that's really important, and so that gives the Zoom F8n Pro a huge advantage over the MixPre. Personally, I find most of those microphone capsules from Zoom to be kind of mediocre, not that great. I will say that the Zoom F8n Pro is definitely more power efficient than a SoundDevices MixPre II. MixPre II has a lot of great features, but power efficiency is not one of its biggest features. I found that you can power on the exact same external Cine battery, for example, like something like this. With the same battery, you can power the Zoom F8n Pro longer. Now, it's going to depend on how many inputs you're using, whether you're using phantom power, whether you're using a really high sample rate. There are all sorts of factors, but overall, the Zoom F8n Pro appears to be a little bit more power efficient than the SoundDevices MixPre II. The MixPre has some really interesting plugins, but they are plugins. We'll come back to that in just a second. But Noise Assist, if you need something where you can do real-time noise reduction in your recording or streaming live, the MixPre has an add-on plugin called Noise Assist, which is really, really nice and really, really useful. You have no option like that on the F8n Pro itself. You could hack together something by running your audio via USB from the F8n Pro into your computer and then through a digital audio workstation with a noise reduction plugin, but you're going to experience a lot more latency, so there are just a lot of trade-offs. I'm just saying that that's one advantage that the MixPre has. On the other hand, the Zoom F8n Pro comes with Mix Assist. It's not a paid add-on plugin like it is on the MixPre. And it also comes with the ability to record ambisonic recordings. So if you have something like a Sennheiser Ambio or other ambisonic microphones, you can do that and do those recordings natively on the F8n Pro without buying an add-on plugin like you would need to do on the MixPre. A nuance here for those that know a little bit more about engineering: the max input level on the F8n Pro's microphone inputs is +4 dBu, which is actually kind of not very high. Well, on the MixPre II, the mic inputs can handle up to +14 dBu. So if that's an important thing for you, if you're recording a lot of really, really, really loud sounds, that's an important factor to take into consideration. I will say that you could potentially, if you're recording super loud sounds, like an operatic singer with a close mic or jet engines a few meters away, one other thing you could consider doing with the Zoom F8n Pro that would work, if your microphone can handle those sound pressure levels, is actually put it into line input mode as opposed to microphone input. That buys you a whole bunch more headroom. So just something to keep in mind if that's important to you. Now I have to answer this question because some people will feel unfulfilled if they don't hear me actually state an opinion on this. But if the question was, Curtis, you can only have a Zoom F8n Pro or a SoundDevices MixPre II, which would you choose? I'll be honest, I would choose the MixPre still. That's a very personal, subjective decision. I would just say this: you can make amazing recordings with the Zoom F8n Pro or the SoundDevices MixPre. It's just a matter of learning your recorder really well and learning how to optimize its performance. It's learning how to place your microphones, to choose the right microphone for the right job, to make sure that you're, not putting your cables right next to AC power adapters and introducing hum and buzz into your recordings. I mean, there are a million things that you have to do, but these are tools that we're talking about here. And the Zoom F8n Pro, again, in my opinion, is an amazing recorder. And I would say the best recorder that Zoom has ever produced. So, in summary, there's no clear-cut, objective winner over the Zoom F8n Pro versus the MixPre. I'm sorry for those of you that wanted a clear-cut answer. I think they're both amazing recorders for different reasons. So, hopefully, all of those things are helpful for you. I just want you to understand you can make great recordings with both of those recorders. And I think it's really about investing in yourself and learning the skills to get great recordings and not just the tool itself. So keep that in mind when you're making your purchase decisions, and when you're trying to get great quality recordings, consider that you do really need to invest in yourself and your skill set to get there. Hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.